So we're continuing to go through the Gospel of John and looking at stuff. And one of the reasons I decided to do this is I want us to just remind us all the time about what kind of people that Jesus wanted to connect with. The answer to that is all kinds, everybody. And it's not just some. He's interested in grumpy people, happy people, depressed people. Okay, we see that actually in the accounts. And wealthy people, poor people, middle of the road, middle class people. He's interested in Democrats, in today's language, Republicans, or whatevers. Okay, it doesn't matter. Okay, and social conservatives, progressives, libertarians, doesn't matter. Okay, he's interested in everybody, the moral, the immoral. It doesn't matter what color you are, and I've often thought about this. Most people who identify as white, they're not really white. We're kind of pinkish, actually. He's even interested in pink people, and it's true. And he offers his acceptance to moralistic people, to immoral people, to everybody. Okay, and we've already seen in this account that we've seen him encounter working class people that he elevated, made them part of his inner circle. We've seen him interact and connect with skeptics, and he overcame their skepticism. We've seen him with happy people. You know what he did with the happy people? He kept the party going. He kept it going. And prominent moral people, he respectfully still pointed out their need for God. Okay, and what he came to bring. And disliked, immoral people, we've seen that. He pulled them in, and with patience and kindness, restored them. And powerful people, he demonstrated a power that was bigger than anything they could ever hope for. Okay, and healing their son. Last week we looked at sideline people that are on the sidelines, and he met their physical and their spiritual needs. And today, we're going to see what happened when he interacted and connected and encountered a group of needy, a big crowd of needy people. And this first account we're going to read this morning is recorded in all four of the accounts of Jesus' life. All four of the Gospels contain this miracle that we're going to witness, okay? And what it's going to show us is what Jesus can do with even just a little bit, the little bit that we have. That if you entrust it to him, what he can do in those times of scarcity. Plus, there's a hidden meaning that we're going to find and discover as we go through this. Okay, so in John chapter 6, it says Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. This big salty kind of body of water that had a lot of fish in it. Okay, and a great crowd of people followed him. So they saw him going across the lake. They wanted to know where he was going, and so they started making their way around land to where he was going to go land. And so they saw what he had done with these sick people, and so they wanted more of that. And so this crowd followed him, and with a sense of expectation, what is he going to do next? Okay, and then it says that Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. He went up on the hillside, and it was the Jewish Passover was near. What that does is it gives us a timestamp. We know that it was springtime, when the grass was green and lush. And when Jesus looked up and he saw this huge crowd, of people coming, he said to one of his closest guys, Philip, he said, where are we going to buy bread for all these people to eat? And it says that he asked him to do this just to test him, to see what his answer was going to be. And Philip answered him. Philip was unimaginative. He was practical, okay? Like a lot of you guys probably, and he looked at reality, okay, and he said it would be 8 months' wages, and if we spent 8 months' wages, it wouldn't even be enough bread for everybody just to have a bite, okay. What do you mean we're going to feed them? We didn't know these people were coming. And then another one of his disciples, Andrew, spoke up, and he said he was a little more hopeful and positive. He said, here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. So here's a kid with his lunch, basically, right? But then he kind of questions his own suggestion. He says, but how far will this little bit go and feed so many? How far would this go with so many people? So, I want to ask you to think about yourself for a second. Who are you more like? Philip, okay, kind of practical, but maybe doubting? Or are you more like Andrew, optimistic, cautiously hopeful? Now think about that. And Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, and everybody sat down. It says that there were about 5,000, I'm sorry to point this out, men. Okay, I guess the ladies and the children didn't count or something, I don't know, but they number this as 5,000 men, okay? But probably about 10,000 people. Okay, this huge crowd, okay? We know it is the feeding of the 5,000, but there's that caveat tucked in there. And it's a beautiful scene. We know from some of the other accounts he had them sit in groups of 50s and 100s. It was this lush, grassy hillside. You know, the people, a lot of the people in this culture would have worn bright clothing. And so you got this green hillside with these people gathered all over the side of this hill, this blue vault of heaven, the sea in the background, the grass, everything. It's just a beautiful scene. And then Jesus took this kid's lunch. First he took the bread, and it said he gave thanks. And then they started to distribute the bread among those who were seated, and they had as much as they wanted. Okay. Now then it says that he did the same thing with the fish. Now when it says he gave thanks, this wasn't rub-a-dub-dub, thank God for the grub. Okay, that's not what he's doing. Okay, this is like real perspective. This is like a sincere thankfulness for this little bit that was provided, and thankfulness that in the hands of the Creator, the scarcity, what looks like scarcity, could be multiplied. It could be more than enough. And you know how it is sometimes with little boys especially, you tell them, hey, don't take so much, right? There was none of that, okay? As much as they wanted, they were able to eat. There was plenty of food, and it was like, take as much as you want, was more the posture of the people serving it. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said to the disciples, gather the pieces that are left over and let nothing be wasted. God's provided, what he's provided needs to be cherished and that should never be wasted. And they gathered up and filled 12 basketfuls, pieces of bread and leftover fish. So this is just a scene of a great abundance. You follow that? It's a miracle. And what's really going on here, I think, is that there's both a private thing and a public thing going on. The private thing is happening mainly with his disciples, okay? He's building up their faith and their confidence in what he could do, even in what looks like a scarce situation. Then there's this public thing. There's the crowd, and we're going to find out that they knew what happened. They had some idea about it, but he's meeting their felt needs. They had this need for food, and he's meeting that need. So the obvious idea from this story, right, this account, is that if Jesus could do all this with some couple of rolls and a can of sardines, basically, right, feed all these people, imagine what he could do with what little you have. Imagine what he could do with little old you, right? Imagine that. And this wasn't the only time he did something like this. There was another time he fed over 4,000 people, okay? And that's recorded for us. One place that's recorded in Mark is in Mark 8. Let me read this. During those days, another large crowd gathered, and since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to himself, and he said, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days. So a little bit different scenario, and they have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, some will collapse on the way because some of them have come a really long distance. And the disciples said, but where are we going to get in this remote place? There's no stores. There's no bakeries around here. Where are we going to get enough food for these people to eat? And he said, how many loaves do you have? They had 7. He told the crowd to sit down. He took the 7 loaves. He gave thanks, broke the bread. Somehow it kept breaking. He gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks again for that, told the guys to do the same thing. The people ate, were satisfied, and afterward the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 people were present. Again, the lesson is obvious, right? When we face times of scarcity, Jesus can meet our need. That's the obvious need. He takes a couple of rolls, can of sardines, and he's able to do this amazing, miraculous thing. But there was also another reason he did this. and it's recorded for us, okay? There's more at play here, actually. And so there were forces in that world, as there are forces in our world, okay, that wanted to harness, okay, Jesus for political reasons, okay? They wanted to do that, okay? There were some Jews that coddled up with the Romans, and that was one of these groups. There was a quasi-religious group and political group called the Sadducees. I say quasi-religious because the way you remember the Sadducees is they didn't believe that there was life after death. Even though they were in charge of the temple and they had these religious roles, they didn't really believe. They didn't believe in an afterlife, so they were Sadducee. Okay, that's how you remember the Sadducees. Okay, but they were powerful. Okay, and then there was another group, a purely political group called the Herodians. Okay, and their interests were similar to the Sadducees. The Sadducees had saddled up to the Roman powers that were occupying their land because there was power there, and that's what they wanted. And they had this quasi-religious thing going. But then there were also the Herodians, who were just purely political animals. Okay, and so they did that. And then there was another faction that was major, and they were called the Pharisees. They were generally respected by the people, okay? And they considered themselves to be the guardians of cultural conservatism, okay? They were the ones that were charged by God to make sure that people did things right, okay? And had right ideas and all this kind of stuff, okay? And because of his growing influence, they were suspicious of Jesus, but they also would do things to try to get him to align with their agenda. Okay, both groups, both sides of this wanted that. And so the question becomes, who gets to set Jesus' agenda? That's really the question. And the crowd tried to set his agenda after lunch, the crowd of 5,000 plus men and women, or women and men, women and kids, I'll say it that way, okay? And the people weren't content, evidently, with this simply being a lesson about how to make it through scarcity. Okay? Instead, they wanted Jesus to direct his supernatural power toward another problem that they all agreed upon, and that was the problem of the Roman occupation. Okay? They were like, okay, if he can do all this, imagine what he could do if we unleashed the dog into that realm. And so John records this in his account of the feeding of the 5,000. It says, after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say to each other, surely, this is the one we were expecting. This is the prophet. This is the Messiah. This is the one that's going to make everything right in the world that was predicted by our scriptures. And Jesus, it says, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, that the crowd was going to try to force him to become their king, he withdrew and went off to a lonely place into a mountain by himself. He was going to have none of it. They wanted to set his agenda, and they knew Jesus knew they intended to do so, but he denied them the opportunity. He got out of there. He wasn't going to do that. So in response to the feeding of the 5,000, the crowd tried to align him with their agenda. Okay, that he was going to do it, and he was going to have nothing to do with that. Who's going to set his agenda? He is. He's going to set his agenda. He insisted on that, okay? And then after the feeding of the 4,000, some Pharisees, they wanted to go, try to get up to him and say, maybe we can win him over, okay? And so some Pharisees started to explore the possibility of harnessing and guiding his unique abilities for their purposes. In Mark chapter 6, continue on the story of the feeding of the 4,000, it says, after he sent the crowd away, he got into the boat with his disciples, and they went to the region of Dalmanutha. Okay, don't ask me where that is because I didn't look it up. Okay, but it's just on the other side of the lake. Okay, and when they got over there, the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus, and to test him, they began to ask him for a sign from heaven. Hey, do another miracle. Do a miracle for us. And see, they're trying to set his agenda. And he sighed deeply, and he said, why does this generation ask for a sign? Why? I tell you the truth, under these conditions, no sign will be given it. You don't get to set my agenda, okay? And then he left the Pharisees, he got back into the boat, and then they're going to go across. The disciples rowed a lot, okay? And they're paddling back across the Sea of Galilee, but the disciples had forgotten to bring any food. And they only had one loaf of bread with them in the boat, okay? And as they were making their way across the lake, this is what I imagine is going on in Jesus' head. He's thinking, about the future of this movement that he's starting, because it has a future. And he was going to entrust these knuckleheads in the boat, okay, with this movement, these guys that are rowing them across the boat, across the lake, and I think fearing that they would be faced with the same pressures to allow others to set the agenda for the movement, he warns them to be careful. And he put it this way. And they didn't understand what he was saying, okay? It says, as they were crossing the lake, Jesus warned them, watch out. Watch out. He said, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Herodians. In Matthew's account, it's not Herodians that are mentioned. They say that he mentioned the Sadducees, these groups that are aligned, okay? And we can imagine that he probably referred to both, okay? That's a more complete understanding because they were both in alignment. And beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Herodians. Well, not knowing what he was talking about, they began to argue with each other, okay? Because they hadn't brought any bread, except for that one loaf. And they thought he was upset because they'd only brought one loaf of bread, okay? And so, Jesus knew they were arguing. They're kind of mumbling, I'm sure. And he said, why are you arguing about not having any bread? Don't you know or understand yet what I'm about, okay? Are your hearts too hard to take in what you're seeing? You have eyes, can't you see? You have ears, can't you hear? Don't you remember anything at all? It wasn't that long ago I fed the 5,000, okay, with 5 loaves of bread. Afterwards, how many leftover baskets full of bread did you pick up? Do you remember the answer? 12. There were 12. They're like, 12. Guys, after I fed the 4,000, okay, with 7 loaves, how many large baskets of leftovers did you pick up? 7. Then he just says, don't you understand yet? They didn't get it. Okay, so these guys had seen this happen. They participated in it. They fed over 9,000 people, okay, with just this, a couple kids' lunches, basically. And if he could feed over 9,000 people with leftovers, okay, why couldn't he feed the 13 guys in the boat with 1 loaf of bread? Right? That's not what he was talking about. Okay, and so in response to his miraculous provision, some wanted to harness and direct him to fulfill what was important to them. But Jesus wasn't going to allow anybody to hijack his agenda. And so when Jesus said, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Herodians, what's he saying? He's saying, don't mix the pervading yeast of the kingdoms of this world, the agendas of this world, into what I'm bringing into the world, okay? Don't mix that up with the kingdom of God. This is completely different because it'll change the composition, because this is what yeast does, right? It'll change the composition of the whole thing. What happens to a batch of dough if you put yeast in it? What does it do? It changes it. It changes it. And you go, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, how do you get it out? You can't get it out. It's changed. It's a different thing, okay? So on the surface, these 2 astounding miracles that he did appear to be, on the surface, just about God's ability to take our times of scarcity, to take the little bit that we have and multiply it, right? And that's definitely a lesson that we can rightly pull out of this story, okay? But it turns out there's another meaning as well. There's something else, okay? And there are crowds in our world today, there are factions in our world today that are trying to hijack Jesus' agenda. Okay, that's just, we still live in the same world they lived in. We're nothing but a bunch of cavemen dressed up in spacesuits. That's who we are. Okay, and what he's saying is to people of all time, don't mix the yeast of the Pharisees, these moralistic, cherry-picked, issues, people, and don't mix that in to your faith. Don't mix moralistic, cultural agendas into your faith. Jesus was about everybody. It didn't matter who they were, where they were at. And don't mix exclusionary, isolationist practices into your faith. Don't mix judgmental, holier-than-thou attitudes that say, it's them. No, it's me, Lord. It's me. I'm the one. And don't mix the yeast of the Herodians, the political types. Aren't you glad that our politicians don't try to hijack the church? They've always been that way. It's nothing new, okay? But don't use the faith to garner political power. That's not what it's about, okay? It's about his power in this pervading kingdom. And don't confuse civics. Engage in civics. I'm on a county board. I'm a chaplain with the sheriff's department. I do all kinds of civic things, okay? But don't confuse that with the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is much bigger than that, okay? And don't mix your patriotism with your faith, okay? Be patriotic, okay? But understand where your real loyalty lies. It's the King who came into this earth from heaven and promises us the gift of residing there. Let's pray. Father, Lord, sometimes you teach us things that are hard to understand. And sometimes, because of how we are, we have a hard time hearing what you have to say, just like your disciples. And we thank you for your patience and with us. And Lord, it's hard.